Hi, my name is Rajat, and in this screencast I'm going to introduce you to the practice of ostracism in ancient Athens, as seen in the artifacts known as the ostraca or ostrakon, which are on display at the Acropolis Museum in Athens, which you can see here. So what is the ostraca? These are basically potsherds, that is broken down pieces of pottery on which names of Athenians of the time have been inscribed. They form part of the annual custom of ostracism, which was practiced in ancient democratic Athens, wherein one Athenian was exiled from the city-state for 10 years. However, to better understand this practice and its significance for us, we need to be cognizant of some background concerning Athens and Athenian democracy of the time. Athens is more or less the birthplace of democracy, but what is perhaps known to a lesser extent is that it was not always so. In the Archaic age, the hereditary elite clans known as the Eupatride clans dominated the political system. Then, around 634 BCE, a young nobleman named Skylon, who was a member of one of these Eupatride clans, decided to stage a revolt. He seized the Acropolis, but the Athenian people barricaded him and forced him out. While Kylon managed to escape, an Athenian official named Megacles, who also belonged to one of these Eupatride clans, captured some of Kylon's co-conspirators under pretense, and he ordered them to be killed. Due to this infraction, Megacles and his family, the Achaemenid clan, were exiled from the Athenian polis for several generations. This example is a precursor to the form of ostracism that we are concerned with. What followed the expulsion of Megacles and his family from the Athenian polis was the first Athenian law code. This was formulated by Draco in 624 BCE and later became renowned for its severity. Towards the following turn of the century, there was some kind of economic crisis, which, coupled with the preceding events, marks for historians a turning point when the Athenian polis becomes ripe for establishing tyranny. Not democracy, but tyranny. This is also the stage when the figure of Solon, who by the way is one of the 7 mythical sages of ancient Greece, is called upon to give a new code of law for the Athenians in 594 BCE. The following decades see further trouble brewing in the Athenian polis, which leads to a division of the Athenian state, known as Attica, into 3 parts. Now, one part of Attica is led by a man named Pisistratus, who is an ambitious ruler with a design to rule over all of Athens. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, Pisistratus establishes himself as the tyrant of Athens in 547 BCE. I would just like to take a moment here and point out that the word tyrant does not have the same connotation in ancient Greece as it does today. To cite the case of Pisistratus, his rule was very successful, and some of the things that we associate with the polis of Athens today were undertaken by him, such as the establishment of the Agora, the Pan-Athenaic Games, the Thespian Festival of Dionysus, and the first Athenian coinage system. A sign of his admiration is that he died peacefully in his old age and never had to use any guards around him in the city. Even Aristotle, who condemns tyranny, had to concede that Pisistratus was an accomplished ruler, and Aristotle refers to him as half bad. After the death of Pisistratus, the reins of the Athenian city-state pass on to his 2 sons, who rule in tandem until one of them is assassinated and the other one is subsequently exiled. So here we see another example of the tradition of exile and expulsion, which had continued well before Athens became a democratic polis. What followed next has been variedly described by historians as the Athenian Revolution. A man named Clisthenes from the Achaemenid clan, you might recall that Megacles was also from the Achaemenid clan, becomes the leader of a popular revolution in 508 BCE and undertakes a system of reforms reconstituting the Athenian constitution. These reforms take the shape of various administrative reconfigurations, judicial reforms, setting up of new council and political offices, which all institute the first Athenian democracy, and which becomes the model for all subsequent democracies in the Western Hemisphere. So it is then Clisthenes, who introduces the institution of ostracism. Now let us consider the system of ostracism in some detail. This was an official process whereby early in the year the assembly was asked if it wanted to have an ostracism. If it voted in the affirmative, later on in the year there was another vote where a quorum of 6,000 citizens was to be needed. The citizens were then supplied with ostraca, which was the potsherd which you can see here, on which they wrote the name of one individual. These were deposited in collection vases and then counted. The citizen who got the most votes had to leave Athens for 10 years. There was no appeal to this. This system was clearly meant as a measure to deter tyranny. If someone was getting too popular, they could just be ostracized. According to Aristotle, this was one of the most democratic reforms by Clisthenes. The ancient clans, that is the Euparite clans, routinely use this democratic mechanism as a weapon against their political opponents. The classical scholar Sarah Fosdyke has written of this custom that perhaps no ancient Greek practice is more opaque to us than the Athenian institution of ostracism. Scholars have repeatedly labeled it as bizarre, intrinsically paradoxical, and even exotic. Several scholars have argued that there was a strong correlation between exile and political power in classical Greece, and that this relation had a formative effect on the institutional and ideological development of the Greek polis. During the Archaic period, that is 750 BCE and until 500 BCE, the elite clans, that is the Euparite clans, engaged in competitions for power which could be violent and frequently expelled one another from their own polis. This so-called politics of exile was a particularly unstable convention since the exiled elites would often call on foreign allies to help them return to their polis and expel their opponents in turn. Many of the institutional developments of the archaic polis can be viewed as attempts by the Euparite clans to prevent violent conflicts over power and the political instability that it led to. It was in Athens then that, as a consequence of particularly frequent episodes of expulsion during the late 7th and 6th centuries of the BCE, first Solon and then Pisistratus attempted to stabilize their polis by encouraging non-elites to play a role in the allocation of political power. By prompting non-elites to intervene in the conflict between these Euparite clans and to place their support behind one particular elite group, these leaders aimed to prevent the frequent changes of power that resulted from violent conflicts solely between these narrow Euparite clans. It is also interesting to note that Pisistratus allowed his political opponents to remain in Athens and enjoy a measure of prestige during his rule. That is, he did not resort to ostracism. The revolution in 508 BCE, by which the democracy was established under the reforms instituted by Clisthenes, was a direct outcome of the particularly violent episode of this politics of exile among the Euparite clans. During the revolution, the Athenian masses intervened decisively in the struggle between the rival elite groups, placing their support with one group and driving the other clan into exile. This is identified by Dr. Fosdyke as the instance of assertion of control by the free citizens of Athens over decisions of exile. Furthermore, since political power and the power to expel one's opponents were one and the same at this time, the action of the people in taking over decisions of exile was equivalent to the assumption of political power. But this form of democratic ostracism was different from the practice we saw in the previous centuries of the Archaic period, where elites were violently expelled. The Athenian custom, on the other hand, was a democratic institution allowing for expulsion of one individual per year for a limited period of time. So ostracism eventually became a symbol of the moderation and legitimacy of the democratic rule, in stark contrast with the various preceding forms of tyranny, not just of Pisistratus but of the Euparite clans. By now you're probably wondering who all were exiled in this way. Well, the examples crop up for us some of the most notable Athenians of the time. We've already talked about Megacles. Xanthippus, who was a statesman and probably the mastermind behind the Athenian strategy in the Peloponnesian Wars, was also exiled. Themistocles, who helped build up the Athenian fleets and who actually defeated the Persian fleets in the decisive battle at Salamis in 480 BCE, was also ostracized. Alcibiades, perhaps the most charismatic of all known Athenians, who was a general and statesman and who held commands during the Peloponnesian Wars against Sparta, was also exiled. Lastly, and perhaps ironically, Thucydides, the historian, the famous ancient Greek historian, was also ostracized. Now, how is this discussion of ostracism relevant for us today? Or perhaps what can we learn from this practice? I think the takeaway for us here is to think about democratic institutional practice in our own contemporary societies. Would the Arab Spring have happened if modern democratic structures allowed for some form of ostracism? Would it help to eliminate people from society today? But before that, was this a just practice? For if democracy can be criticized for being a popular system of governance where popularity of leaders is more decisive than their competence, can we not make a similar case against ostracism? Regardless, this practice has to be considered or even criticized under the umbrella of democracy. More theoretically, though, social scientists, political theorists, archaeologists, historians, etc., recognize that societies tend to create conceptual boundaries through their rules, and particularly in the case of pre modern cultures, mythologies. These parentheses define who we are and who we are not. So, the practice of ostracism can also be understood in terms of how people define themselves and mediate conflicts. The importance of this practice is underscored, therefore, in any discussion about the best form of government, as was observed by Thucydides and Aristotle. The French philosopher and political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in his treatise, The Social Contract, that if there was a nation of gods, it would be governed democratically. So perfect a government is unsuited to men. What then is the form of government that is ideal for where you live? Or perhaps more precisely, what is the form of democracy ideally suited to your country? Thank you for listening and have a great day.